Welcome to our fourth annual Future of U.S.-China Conference. This is the eighth and final program of our Seeking Truth Through Facts U.S.-China program series. Over the past several months, we've used data and facts to cover topics on intellectual property, the Quad, the Belt and Road Initiative, tech policy, energy, great power politics, and China's strategy post-Cold War. Today, we'll look at where we are 1 year into the Biden administration. At last year's conference, Kurt Campbell joined a panel discussion with us just as he was appointed White House coordinator for the Indo-Pacific. So we'll see how far we've come. And we'll look at where we are with obstacles and opportunities in technology and business. Semiconductors is a topic we've been following for the past 4 years of this conference. And we'll also talk about what the future holds for China's Xi Jinping. We are so pleased to have all of you with us. Nearly 600 people have signed up for today. We welcome our VIP guests, sponsors, and speakers. We have global trustees from Asia Society and global colleagues from our 14 centers around the world with us too. We welcome our Northern California Honorary Chair, Jack Wadsworth, Honorary Chair, Ken Wilcox, and our Chair, Gary Reichel. I'm Margaret Conley, Executive Director of our Northern California Center, and our team really wanted to be with you in person this year. All of our 23 speakers were prepared to join us here in Silicon Valley, including 10 speakers who were going to fly in. But here we are, hosting virtually for the second year in a row. Thank you for staying with us. Last year at this conference, in one of his last public appearances, our Honorary Chair and former Secretary of State, George Shultz, stressed the importance of dialogue and that trust is the coin of the realm. We would like to keep his spirit alive today, offering conversations and a platform that covers and offers complex and sometimes contentious topics with experts and participants with diverse points of view. Because of our current environment, not everyone has been willing to come forward and speak publicly this year, but it is vital to keep these dialogues going. Our mission at Asia Society is to build understanding and navigate shared futures for Asia and the world. It's why we do programs like this one today. And we thank each and every one of our 23 speakers who have come forward to participate with us today. We have a beautiful and detailed program that's been posted on our website. It shows our lineup and topics for today. Full speaker bios are included in there too, and we'll go ahead and put the link to our program in the chat box for you now as well. We'll be hosting 7 hours of live programming today. Last year, we received feedback that we should have included more breaks with Tai Chi stretching. Today, we have 3 breaks for you, but you're on your own for your own Tai Chi. This event is on the record. We have press in the room, and we're recording every session. Videos from our conference last year have 200,000 YouTube views. Those videos are available on our website, and these will all be too. A big thank you to our sponsors. As a nonprofit, we are incredibly grateful for your support for our work. Magdalene Yum, Kenson Ventures, Tencent, Greenberg Traurig, NEA, Lisa Berry, Blackstone, Asia Alternatives, Raise Capital, Dobkin Family Foundation, Silicon Valley Bank, and Fantan Smith. Thank you very, 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 very much. And now for our opening keynote, our CEO, Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, who is joining us from Brisbane with pre-recorded remarks. Let's hear now from Kevin.
Well, greetings to all of you, and thank you for joining us for this important conference, which has been convened by the Asia Society Northern California. There is no more important topic for the decade ahead than the future trajectory of the US-China relationship. And as president of the Asia Society, it's a subject on which I've been working for quite a number of years now. So in the time that we have, let me divide my remarks into 2 or 3 sections. One is to talk about the Chinese domestic drivers of its overall foreign policy posture in 2022, including its relationship with the United States. Second, the current state of that relationship 1 year into the Biden administration. And then thirdly, some reflections on what both Washington and Beijing can do to better manage their bilateral relationship for the year and, in fact, the decade ahead. So let me take those remarks in the sequence I've just outlined. Firstly, the domestic drivers. In the United States, we often assume that Chinese foreign policy is somehow freestanding, that it is conducted by a series of rational actors in Beijing, completely disconnected from Chinese domestic political and economic reality. Part of what I've been saying to American audiences over quite a number of years now is simply this: China has politics too, and China has economics too. And as a consequence of domestic political and economic constraints and opportunities, it does impact overall the trajectory of China's policy towards the world at large, including its principal relationship with the United States. So as we look to the calendar year ahead, 2022, the critical question for us is, how is it shaping up domestically, politically and economically for Xi Jinping? As you all know, 2022 is the year of the 20th Party Congress. Party Congresses are held every 5 years. These are the major supreme decision-making bodies of the Communist Party. They determine the party leadership. They determine the composition of the Central Committee, the Politburo, the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and of course, the General Secretary as well. The convention, which had been established in the post-Deng Xiaoping period, was that for Deng's successors to serve no more than 2 terms. Jiang Zemin slightly exceeded that, but that was because of contingencies arising from how he came to power in the first place following the tumultuous events in Tiananmen in 1989. Hu Jintao complied completely with the convention and remained in power for 2 terms. Xi Jinping's 2 terms are up at the 20th Party Congress, which would take us from the end of 2012 when he took over to the end of 2022. Again, as his audience will be well familiar, Xi Jinping at the 19th Party Congress changed effectively set in motion a series of processes to change the constitution to enable the Chinese president to serve more than 2 consecutive terms. There had technically been no previous restraint on the term limits of the other 2 positions which Xi Jinping occupies, that of General Secretary of the party and that of Chairman of the Central Military Commission. But a problem for Xi Jinping in remaining in power was the constraint around the supreme, as it were, office of state, that is, president of the country. Hence the constitutional change which occurred in the period following the 19th Party Congress in 2017 and executed at the National People's Congress in March of 2018. The reason for my saying all of that is that this, therefore, is not just an average party congress. Average party congresses are hugely important in themselves in determining personnel and strategic policy direction for the future. But beyond that, this particular Congress, the 20th Party Congress, of course, has this added significance of effectively beginning the breach of the 2-term convention. So what's my prognosis in terms of what will happen domestically at the end of this year when the Congress convenes in and around November? Despite some opposition to Xi Jinping's politics and economics and his foreign policy, and despite the fact that some of that opposition is in fact growing, I would certainly give Xi Jinping a 7 or 8 out of 10 probability of being reappointed come the end of this year. But it's not all completely smooth sailing. What are the constraints? Well, firstly, Xi Jinping, in the 9 years he's now been in office, has effectively reconstituted a Maoist form of administration in this particular sense, that is, the complete centralization of political power in his own hands at the expense of the collective leadership forms which were put in place under Deng Xiaoping through the Jiang Zemin period and into the Hu Jintao period. We've seen this progressively unfold since 2012 through one series of measures after another, and certainly since the 19th Party Congress at the end of 2017. But now, Xi Jinping is certainly not just primus inter pares within the Chinese Communist Party elite. He is primus. And as a consequence, we have the emergence of effective one-man rule. This is an important change given where China was nearly 10 years ago. But of course, as happens in political systems anywhere, and within authoritarian political systems as well, we now have the political antibodies at work. And the political antibodies at work are such that we can assume, and we have some evidentiary base to lend support to the idea that there is a reaction underway against this increased concentration of political power in the hands of a single person. It's for that reason that Xi Jinping last year launched a party rectification campaign in order to root out the last major sources of political opposition against him, either on corruption grounds or on party disunity grounds. And that campaign has been unfolding over the last year or two. And that's why, despite the fact that opposition exists, in my overall political judgment, it will not be sufficient to prevail. On domestic economics, however, it's worth bearing in mind that Xi Jinping, again, does not have complete plain sailing for calendar year 22. For those of us following the entrails of the Chinese economy, we all know that China's economic growth rate has been slowing. But the key question is what has caused the slowdown? The reality, of course, is a number of factors, some within the regime's control, others not. The pandemic has had an effect not just on global growth rates, but Chinese domestic growth rates as well, and not least because of the impact on net exports as a driver of Chinese domestic growth. That's one factor. And of course, the regime has been adamant in its prosecution of both the domestic and international political case that it is not responsible for the global spread or even the national spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, and in fact continues to cast doubt over the origins of the virus, which broke out in Wuhan at the end of 2019 and early 2020. But the COVID factor, of course, has been one drag on growth. Another factor, of course, has been a change in economic policy settings by Xi Jinping himself. And the change in economic policy settings that we've seen under Xi Jinping have gained a momentum in the last year or two. I describe it as Xi Jinping taking the economic policy settings of the country increasingly towards the left. What do I mean by that? A resurgence of the role of state-owned enterprises, an attack on large elements of the Chinese private sector, a resuscitation of state planning, and a new wealth redistribution agenda under the rubric of what is called the Common Prosperity Agenda. Now, all that may be fine in terms of adding up to a reasonable set of ideological settings for Xi Jinping leading into the 20th Party Congress. But the bottom line is this. If you do those sort of things for long enough, it does have an effect on private sector business confidence. And if the private sector represents some 60% of Chinese GDP, if you start to see confidence fall, and if you start to see private fixed capital investment come apart, will not come apart so much as at least slow down, then it, as night follows day, it will translate its way through into the economic growth numbers. That has been the second drag on economic growth. The third one, of course, has been the long-term impact of the trade war with the United States. Again, it's not as if China's bilateral trade numbers with the United States have generated a turnaround in the overall trade deficit, which Washington has long had with the People's Republic of China. In fact, quite the reverse. But the impact of the US-China trade war has in fact served to accelerate a global trend towards protectionism, and as a consequence has led to an overall slowing in global trade growth, which in turn has led to, or been accompanied by, a series of disruptions to global supply chains. The net effect of which is trade protectionism, and protectionist measures applied to supply chains have constituted the third drag on growth. Putting all these things together, how does that therefore affect Xi Jinping? One thing which can cause Xi Jinping added political difficulty in the year ahead, that is 2022, is what then happens with China's economic growth numbers. China still needs to register around about 6% growth in order to remain on track to become a bigger economy than the United States sometime by the late 2020s and early 2030s. But more importantly, to continue to provide sufficient new employment growth as well as sufficient increase in living standards to sustain the party's historical social contract with the Chinese people. So my judgment is that the biggest liability which Xi Jinping faces going into the 2022 20th Party Congress is not so much from the domestic political reaction to his usurpation of the principles of collective party leadership and the arrival or the re-emergence of one-man rule, despite the fact that opposition does exist. It is primarily because of his parallel move to the left on the economy and the impact that's had on private sector growth and the impact that in turn has on overall economic growth. Could either of these factors actually generate sufficient momentum to cause Xi to come unstuck at the 20th Party Congress? My judgment at this stage is no, but it will not be plain sailing for the year ahead. And there is already evidence through official commentaries which have been produced in the People's Daily, in Liberation Daily, and in the party's theoretical journal, Qiu Shi, from those who have a different view about the overall balance of China's economic policy settings in particular. So, in summary, on the domestic drivers, let me put it to you in these terms. My judgment is that Xi Jinping will still be in a relatively robust position in 2022 to conduct the foreign policy of his country. But here is my concern. If the pressures on him domestically, either through politics or through the economy, become sharp and begin to affect his re-elect come the end of 22, I am concerned that that would in fact generate a much harder line by Xi Jinping in his foreign policy posture against the United States and more broadly with other countries than would normally be the case. In other words, to begin to circle the nationalist wagons around himself as party leader, moving into the critical phase of the 20th Party Congress at the end of this year. My second set of remarks simply deals with the current state of the US-China relationship itself. Let me summarize it in these terms. By the end of the Trump administration, the US-China relationship was in freefall. Partly that was for structural reasons. That is, China, under Xi Jinping's leadership, has embarked upon a new policy strategy towards the United States, which is to increasingly challenge both bilaterally, regionally, and multilaterally American power. And this is a change from what we've seen in the period prior to 2012. The United States, through the period of the Trump administration in particular, but also evident during the latter period of the Obama administration, has begun to respond directly to that challenge. So for these structural reasons, this underlying challenge to the pre-existing balance of power which favoured the United States, there has been an ongoing deterioration in the state of the US-China relationship, given that there is a competitive race for bilateral, regional and global dominance. That's the reality, whatever the political leadership of both countries may say. However, during the period of the Trump administration, exacerbated by the trade war and exacerbated again by the COVID crisis and the mercurial nature of the Trump presidency and personality itself, all guardrails around the relationship slowly fell away. So by the time we had a new administration elected 1 year ago, and coming to office 1 year ago, I should say, the relationship was genuinely in free fall, both for the structural reasons I just outlined, but also because the other leadership-driven dynamics around Donald Trump meant that there was no longer a predisposition to maintain stability in the relationship, notwithstanding the overall deterioration of it. In the period since the Biden administration has taken office, here is my aggregate judgment that the overall strategic competitive race between the United States and China continues apace. The Biden administration, rightly in my judgment, has assessed that in order for America to remain competitive in this race in the decade ahead, it must rebuild American power at home. And hence the emphasis on the rebuilding of the nation's economic infrastructure, hence the emphasis on the future of America's critical industries, not least of which lie in information technology, as well as the enormous historical competitive advantage which the United States has had in semiconductors. So for those reasons, the Biden administration's number one priority has been to rebuild American economic power at home. I'll leave this audience to make a judgment as to how successful that has been, but that nonetheless has been the strategic intention of the Biden administration from the get-go. Secondly, in terms of the formal architecture of the US-China relationship, the Biden administration has also been plain through a series of actions that it has taken with the Chinese that it is not about to weaken the competitive race with China and not about to artificially, as it were, remove the underlying strategic tension and structural competition which exists. At the same time, however, there has been an interest on the part of Biden, reciprocated by Xi Jinping, to rebuild some of the strategic guardrails around the relationship which did exist in times past. That finally came to a head when we had the Biden-Xi Jinping virtual summit, when it was plain that in terms of the predisposition of both the Chinese and the Americans, they did not want at this stage the relationship to run the risk of sliding completely off the rails and generate crisis, conflict, or even war through either strategic, diplomatic, or political accident. In the period since then, whereas not a lot has happened in a material sense to improve the relationship, it is my judgment that the relationship has not deteriorated further. Even on the question of the upcoming Winter Olympics to be held in China, the predisposition of the Biden administration in terms of its policy on a diplomatic boycott has been such as not to allow the Olympics to turn into some cataclysmic political event in terms of the overall bilateral relationship, as would trigger a broader crisis between Washington and Beijing. So therefore, as we move into the second year of the Biden administration, what could we say overall? The domestic agenda and the domestic strategy to rebuild American power is as I described before, and it's for others to make a judgment as to how successful that has been so far. Of course, those at the Fed and those in the United States Treasury will be having an eagle eye on the inflationary challenge to America's long-term economic growth prospects in terms of the overall effect of the third economic race. But that nonetheless, in terms of rebuilding America at home and starting with the economy, is the cornerstone of US strategy in dealing with China. Secondly, strategic competition remains in place. It hasn't changed in terms of its fundamental substance between Washington and China, and in fact has continued apace. But thirdly, since Xi Jinping and Biden summit, my judgment is that both sides have found it in their interest to construct some strategic guardrails and for the lines of diplomatic and political communication to open up to the extent that there are lines of communications now which would be able to be deployed more effectively in managing a crisis should one arise, particularly through a military accident. Let me conclude my remarks by simply saying this. I've spoken today about the domestic drivers of Xi Jinping's approach to the US-China relationship in 2022. I've also spoken about the current state of the US-China relationship 12 months into the Biden administration. But what of the future? In a month or two, I'll be releasing a book I've spent several years working on, entitled The Avoidable War. It will outline in some detail my approach to what I describe as a doctrine of managed strategic competition. That is, a relationship between Beijing and Washington, which could, in the broader structure, be agreed in order to identify those areas where there are strategic red lines, to have mechanisms in place to manage crises around those red lines. Secondly, to have fully open competition in the other domains of the relationship, economic, foreign policy, and technological, and of course in a range of other domains as well. But thirdly, to also carve out political space for sustained strategic cooperation in areas such as climate change, nuclear non-proliferation, but also future global pandemic management. I look forward to being able to speak with you in your conference and through the Northern California Center of the Asia Society further about this book when it comes out at the end of March. Thank you so much for your attention. I wish you well in this conference.
Our thanks to Kevin, and we look forward to when his book comes out so we can host him again here in Northern California.